Is Peter Boykin. I am an instructor of history at the Wayne County Community College District in Detroit, Michigan. And today I would like to expound on my grandfather, the late Ulysses Wilhelm Boykin. And my grandfather was definitely a prodigious man, a man of great character and just a giant in his own life. He was born in October of 1914 in Knoxville, Tennessee, to my great grandfather, Ulysses Simpson Boykin, and my great grandmother, Curtis Hurd Boykin. My grandfather also had two siblings. He was, in fact, the middle child. The oldest was his brother, my granduncle, uh, A. Wade Boykin, and then he had a sister, uh, Eleanor Boykin. In the early 1920s, at the pinnacle of the Great Migration, the Boykin family moved to Groseal and then they would settle in Detroit. The family would become members of Second Baptist Church. For those of you who are not from Detroit or understand the dynamics of the African American community, Second Baptist is the oldest African American congregation in Michigan. It has roots going back to the Underground Railroad. The church was used as a sanctuary for slaves who were migrating to Detroit and would want to stay here. And if they didn't, they would continue on and go across the river to Windsor, Ontario, and continue their migration further into the province. While at Second Baptist, even as a youth, my grandfather was very involved in numerous organizations. He graduated from Northeastern High School, which was a uh, high school of excellence for African Americans in Detroit. A lot of prominent, well known African Americans came out of there, like Wilson Pickett, the singer who was with the group The Falcons. The name Falcons for the group represents the mascot at the school. So it was located on the east side of Detroit, just right above the downtown area. And you have to understand at this time, blacks were segregated illegally in Detroit. So the school pretty much was on the perimeter of Black Bottom or Hastings Street, which was Detroit's version of Harlem. And that is the area where the Boykin family resided, and just east of Black Bottom. After Northeastern, he went on to matriculate at Wayne State University, the public university for Detroit, and he didn't graduate from there, but he did at least get in about 1 or 2 years of college, and then he began his career as a journalist in 1936, and he began writing for the Michigan Chronicle, which was one of the preeminent African American newspapers in Detroit. He was an assistant editor there, and then he became the city editor. From there, he moved on to work at the Detroit Tribune, where he started as an assistant editor and then became editor, and later on, he would become the publisher of the paper along with my grandmother, Cecil. Aside from his journalism duties, my grandfather was also engaged in public relations. He performed public relations for many well known African American entertainers like Joe Louis, who, of course, was from Detroit. And what my grandfather would do, and this is according to accounts from my father, he would autograph Joe Louis's signature when the Brown Bomber, as he was called, would tour around the United States for promotional tours. So basically, public relations entails branding and the marketing of clients. He also dealt with the American Medical Association, which was the African American doctors group, and he also represented numerous politicians which eventually led him to get heavily involved in politics. By the 1950s, he was a member of the Republican Party. Another quick history lesson: African Americans are members of the Republican Party going back to Abraham Lincoln because they were for integration, they supported Reconstruction, and most definitely they supported the freeing of African Americans. So he pretty much attended every single Republican National Convention from the 50s, and we're talking about back when Eisenhower was president all the way up to 1980 when it was here in Detroit. He was also very well known and active in the state party as a delegate, and knew many governors like George Romney and also William Milliken. In 1969, my grandfather, Ulysses Boykin, was hired by WGPR, which at that time was a brand new African American owned radio station. It was started in the early 60s. It was originally called Grosse Pointe Radio. That's what the call letters WGPR stood for, and Grosse Pointe is an adjacent suburb to Detroit. And Dr. William Vernoy Banks bought the station and converted it to a rhythm and blues station. Dr. Banks was also a member of a Masonic order that owned African American owned radio stations throughout the United States. Now we enter into the 1970s, and the Masonic group was looking at creating the first African American owned television station at WGPR. You have to understand the dynamics of the early 70s. Richard Nixon was president, and one thing that he accentuated was black capitalism. He wanted African Americans to have ownership and promoted cultural diversity in the business world. You look at James Brown, he had a radio station and various business ventures. Also, you had Soul Train, which came on the air in 1971 as the first television show that was produced and basically controlled by an African American, and that was Don Cornelius. So I could also safely insinuate that it was probably the Soul Train movement which motivated my grandfather and the others at WGPR to pursue creating a television station. So my grandfather got assistance from my father, Ulysses Boykin, who was employed at that time with Patman Young and Kirk. It was an up-and-coming African-American-owned law firm in Detroit that represented a lot of black entertainers, such as the Dramatics, the producers, Holland Dozier and Holland, who wrote many great hits at Motown and then formed their own company entitled Invictus Records in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And this is my father, basically did all the legal groundwork for WGPR to become a reality. The next component of this was that he met with Dr. Benjamin Hooks. Benjamin Hooks was definitely a trailblazer. He was the first African American judge in the state of Tennessee, and also he was a minister here in Detroit at Greater New Mount Moriah Church, and then very involved with the NAACP. So when he met my grandfather, Hooks was the head of the FCC, the Federal Communications organization with the federal government. So whenever you have to get a license for a TV station or a radio station, you have to go through the auspices of the FCC in order to go on the air. My grandfather met with Dr. Hooks, and also he met with President Ford, because this was now 1974. Nixon, of course, had been impeached by Watergate and forced out of office, and Ford ascended to the throne as President of the United States. And after numerous meetings, WGPR finally became a reality in 1975. In the fall of 1975 is when the station came on air. And when it came on air, it was designated as the first African American owned television station, public station in the whole United States. It was very versatile for the time. They had a newscast called Big City News that produced many local talent that would go on to the mainstream stations like Amir Jacobson. She was on Channel 50, 10 o'clock news for a long time. Pat Sweeney, who was at WWJ, and I had the opportunity of working with Miss Sweeney when I was in college at Hampton University. I had aspirations of going into journalism, and I had an internship at the station, and I remember talking with Miss Sweeney about my grandfather, and she even gave me a tape that she had done of him, as well as my granduncle, Uncle Wade, who was an accomplished musician here in Detroit. WGPR also had a TV show that pretty much mimicked Soul Train called The Scene. They also had live simulcasts on radio, the WGPR radio station 107.5, which still exists today with the show. And they would also have, just like Soul Train, nationally known artists come in and perform live on the show. I actually knew my grandfather, and at the time I was about 3, 4 years old when I had the earliest recollection of him. He died when I was 11, and I just never knew the greatness of my grandfather. I really did not realize this until much later in life, that he, in fact, had started the first African American owned television station in the United States. So to me, I mean, that just speaks immense volumes